want to be a playboy's bunny. I'd do whatever they asked me to. I'd meet people with lots of money, and men would love me like I loved you. I want to be an artist model, an odalisco naturel. I should be good at spin the bottle, while I still got something left to sell. Hey everybody, my name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary, a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases, then attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. When I last left off earlier this week, I had just gotten done giving you my 2 cents on Late Night with the Devil. Please check out that review if you haven't, because we're now ready to move on to the second feature of that personal double bill of recent horror films I curated last week, with Immaculate, directed by Michael Moen, written by Andrew Lobel, and starring Sydney Sweeney. Sweeney plays Sister Cecilia, an inexperienced but devout American nun who accepts an invitation from one Father Saul Tedeschi, Alvaro Morte, to serve at a reclusive convent in the rural outskirts of Rome that specializes in end-of-life treatment for dying nuns. As you might expect, this convent is not precisely an idyllic setting. Moen and cinematographer Alicia Christian present it from the outset with a very muted and cold color palette, one that's downright pallid. But then again, there's not likely to be a lot of tension when you decide to open your movie with an extended cold open in which a younger nun attempts to escape from the convent and is then buried alive by a trio of red mask-wearing assailants for her efforts. Cecilia herself is at first quite isolated in the community. She doesn't speak any Italian, and she also encounters some rather severe hostility from Sister Isabella, played by Giulia Heathfield di Renzi, who immediately presumes that Cecilia is just like a lot of young Americans who simply see a spiritual life as a calling to find themselves, ill-prepared for the orders to truly give themselves over to the unique needs of the aged and the dying, many of whom in the convent are not only physically invalid, but suffering from various forms of mental illness, including dementia. But old crones wandering around in the night turns out to be just the tip of the iceberg in terms of ominous portents. There are also these strange cross-shaped brandings that Cecilia discovers scarred into the soles of some of the patient sisters' feet, as well as a second chapel located underneath the convent close to some ancient catacombs, the centerpiece of which is an artifact, a long iron nail that Cecilia is told by the Mother Superior was taken from the cross on which Jesus Christ was crucified. It is following Cecilia's encounter with this nail that she enters a state of nightmarish delirium. Weeks later, she begins to experience illness, and after receiving a standard blood test, is revealed to be pregnant despite having never had sexual intercourse. Suspiciously, Father Saul and the rest of the male clerics administering the convent immediately declare Cecilia's conception to be immaculate, and Cecilia is virtually transformed overnight from an ordinary, ignoble American girl into a living icon that the convent is prepared to keep and protect at all costs, even as her physical health precipitously declines and Cecilia grows increasingly unwary that she may be being held captive to dark and sinister motives. I think the first visceral sense that I got that Immaculate wasn't going to prove to be a terribly endearing experience, even as a generic horror film, came relatively early. There's this scene that takes place on the night that Cecilia arrives and the new nuns are being treated to a celebratory dinner party after the Mass in which they officially receive their orders from the Cardinal. And Cecilia is talking to Father Saul about her background, and Cecilia begins describing an experience she had at a very young age when she fell through some ice and nearly drowned, being revived after 7 minutes of being declared dead. And in the midst of describing this horrific experience, Moen and editor Christian Massini smash cut to this image of Cecilia as a child trapped underneath the ice, screaming through the icy water as a harsh soundtrack cue screeches at you. And the thing about it was that despite this being the first real overtly shocking moment of the film, the first sudden jump scare, at least in the audience I watched it in, you could have heard a pin drop in the theater. Nobody really jolted or reacted, even though we should have had every reason to. It was not a jump scare that was particularly telegraphed. It came out of nowhere, but no, we're all just sort of sitting here with this anemic feeling of, well, that was loud. And look, I'm not about to claim that Moen doesn't pack in a few decent jump scares here and there. There are certainly a few more successfully shocking moments to come in Immaculate, some decently well-crafted scares, but I think that pretty much perfectly describes the tenor of Immaculate as an overall horror movie experience. What should be exactly the sort of things that get you jolted in your seat, just the most elemental basics of a contemporary horror film, just fall so flat that you would be inclined to think that it was because it was overly telegraphed. But no, you really do become overly conscious as you're watching the film, even just from the very beginning, that there just isn't any palpable degree of dread or tension, no atmospheric sense of unease. The establishing drama is just kind of flat and unmoving, so your only reaction when a moment like that happens is to shrug and acknowledge it, maybe even be a little annoyed that this movie tried to scare you, but you just ended up hurting your ears. In the very moments when Moen and Lobel's script should be teasing out a sense of dread, getting us invested in the characters, sowing the seeds of what's to come, they instead just give away the game far too early, from that cold open of the nun being buried alive, all the way up until Cecilia discovers that she's experiencing this miraculous pregnancy, at which point Moen and Lobel simply flash forward 6 months in time and expect us to be primed and ready to start peeling back the mystery of what's really going on at the heart of this perturbing, strange tale. But there's really nothing to get invested in. There's nothing to be curious about because the stakes and Moen's direction is so obvious from the very beginning that you feel like you're just being sort of subjected to content and plot information than really following a narrative emotionally. And it's clear that emotion should be more important to Moen. One of the most interesting things he does in the beginning of the film, on the same night as that trapped under ice jump scare, the way he and Christian warmly capture the interaction between Father Saul and Cecilia can't help but come off as romantic, with Father Saul clearly being more than just professionally friendly or nurturing of Cecilia, clearly being infatuated by her. But that foreshadowing of romantic tensions transgressing sacred vows, that foreshadowing of impure thought, it doesn't really get expanded upon or go anywhere. It literally just is. Again, this basically flatly presented narrative content that, in terms of Cecilia's relationship with Father Saul, which of course is doomed to turn antagonistic, this is very much a baby's first feminist horror movie in that regard, just never really feels like it carries over except as this compartmentalized scene and detail, much in the same way as Father Saul's own past as an experimental biologist who rediscovered his faith after being disenchanted by secular science is clearly intended to be something where we get to the climactic twist of the true diabolical nature of Cecilia's Immaculate Conception and go, oh, aha, that was foreshadowed before, except we reach that revelation and we're just like, oh no, that just seems like it was just some extraneous detail that only relates as superficially as possible to the twist, where I can understand schematically how this is supposed to be a theme running through the film, except that the theme doesn't run, insofar as it has any bearing on what Cecilia goes through or how she and Father Saul get to, like, meaningfully interact with those themes as characters, rather than just us simply being told, here's some character content, and being expected to really be intrigued by that enough so that an hour later we find out what's really going on and we have that cathartic, oh my god, I get it moment. The dramaturgical flaws of Immaculate just seem so incredibly obvious, right down to the fact that everyone in control of the convent so immediately embraces Cecilia's pregnancy as miraculous that way more of your mental energy errs on the side of, well, that's just stupid, rather than really wondering why or being disturbed by the fact that they act that way. Part of me wants to give Moen and Lobel the benefit of the doubt in that regard, that part of the intent of how Immaculate is structured and paced is that you're supposed to come to this late-blooming realization that this is largely a black comedy, that the crude, loud, vulgar absurdity is the point, that the objective is not to create atmospheric religious horror, but to create a horrific religious farce. And I'm not about to say that from just that subnormal perspective, there aren't parts of Immaculate that are genuinely funny in terms of their willful, crude absurdity. There's definitely a couple inspired deadpan lines and some decent, dumb, violent spectacle. But let's be real here. Moen is no Verhoeven. There isn't a single satiric bone in this film's whole body. It's just kind of a glib spectacle that relies on the easiest, most generic prejudice against organized religion that any person could have, but doesn't actually meaningfully touch upon the absurdities of organized religion as systems, as ideological institutions, and not just things you non-theistically declare dumb because they believe dumb things. I'll give you a perfect example. Another great moment of compartmentalized content that goes nowhere thematically. One of the first people Cecilia befriends at the convent is named Sister Gwen. She's played by Benedetta Porcaroli, and when she's learning that Cecilia's church in her hometown was closed down, she immediately assumes that it must have been because of some sex abuse scandal, only to learn that it was just because of declining attendance. Now, in Baby's first feminist horror, it's obvious how this story of a woman who experiences a miracle, but because of that is literally made a prisoner, is inevitably going to go into territory playing upon the repression of women, and especially sexual or bodily violation. But the problem is that sort of glib evocation as an ex-Catholic who began his long journey of completely losing his faith because of being a devout Catholic young person, suddenly being confronted with the horrific knowledge of sexual abuse and systemic cover-up in the Catholic Church. That sort of thing touches a very raw nerve with me, where I should be the one primed to be on the side of your movie in terms of its satiric, horrific caricature of Catholicism. Instead, though, I'm sitting here at the moment when these dumb old men are just overnight declaring that one of their nuns has experienced Immaculate Conception, and I'm both bored by it and I'm also a little perturbed, honestly, because once Moen and Lobel decide that any pretense of Immaculate Conception actually being, kind of controversial as a claim that this young nun has to make, the fact that they decide that even any performative pretense of controversy or tension or what these characters would go through when faced with a scenario like this, the fact that they decide that it just doesn't even matter, that's when I realized that none of it matters. That they don't take any of this seriously. It really is just all a glib joke to them. In the same way that systemic abuse in the Catholic Church is just a one-off joke, Immaculate really is just another maudlin farce centered upon the religiously coded violation and torture of a young woman that only has the pretenses of a satiric view of religion, where the vague specter of the church as this violating organization is just the means of projecting what is simply the dumb, baseline, crude, and not at all very excitingly rendered desires of the filmmakers, and making it seem like this is about more than that. This is a movie that wants to have its cake and eat it too. As a farce, it wants to allude to the real-world scandal and crime, which is fundamentally borne out by the fact that the Catholic Church is basically just this faceless bureaucracy. The extravagant ritual and overtures of charismatic faith are there to mask what is simply a matter of social influence, and when someone in your organization does something horrid, conspiracies of silence to maintain good public relations. But then all it wants to do is return to these easy caricatures of faith, where no, the violation and oppression doesn't occur because of any sincere but cynical motivations, it's just because everyone is crazy and stupid. They just live in this hermetic world where they believe in crazy shit like transubstantiation and religious artifacts and immaculate conception, and look how crazy we can make this. Don't trouble yourself about crafting characters with a strong presence and where you get some actual tension and uncertainty and conflict. Everyone's just along for the ride for no reason. They're just crazy and stupid. This is also apparently a project of particular interest for Sweeney. This is the second film she's produced, having been an executive producer on her and husband Glenn Powell's Anyone But You, which makes it all the more depressing to just... Look, I'm sorry, she's awful. She's awful in this. Her performance is terrible. She'll literally be playing this character, carrying this apocryphal miracle child, vomiting so much that she discovers her back molar has fallen out of her mouth, getting wheeled around, strapped to a wheelchair. But she's so wooden as an expressive actor that even at the lowest moments, she can't seem to manifest an affect that looks like much more than a middle schooler who was grounded, and it's just all so unfair. It doesn't look like she's being oppressed or imprisoned or tortured. It looks like she's just bored and impatient, which, given the quality of the material, I would agree there's reason to be bored and impatient, but you're producing the damn thing. I take no pleasure in saying this either. Sweeney has been a highly objectified actor for a very long time, and in recent months, that objectification has taken on some very weird political turns, and while I know she can deliver very good work, speaking of reality from last year, I think the contrast between how good she was in that film versus how abundantly mediocre she's been in virtually everything else kind of perfectly illustrates the strange degree that we're still not prepared to just be normal about her as a kind of mediocre actor with a very limited range who we're seeing way too much of, not only because she was so thoroughly objectified and astroturfed so desperately as this new classic Hollywood blonde bombshell that everyone seems to think is completely outdated and stupid, but also because it seems like there's just this kind of knee-jerk overcorrection for how poorly and weirdly she was objectified that we don't really take a step back and acknowledge that, okay, she just isn't terribly exciting as a performer in most things, that her screen presence is highly astroturfed and pretentious. That when it comes down to it, even in this pallid, flat little horror film, she's not even a very compelling scream queen. Also, can we all just acknowledge that this was, clearly just an old-fashioned Hollywood exploitation cash grab? What? It's a coincidence that we're getting this Omen-style horror movie set in a convent about a young nun encountering an occult conspiracy literally just 2 weeks before 20th Century is set to release their official Omen prequel, also set in a convent in Rome, and also about a young nun encountering an occult conspiracy, and both of those films feature scenes in their trailers of the protagonist watching in horror as another nun leaps to their death. There's a good chance a lot of you out there have literally sat through this whole review convinced that I was talking about the first Omen, when I was really talking about a completely different film, and I'm not even someone who's against exploitation cash grabs. Sometimes they can be a load of fun, but yeah, Immaculate. Far from it. Flat, boring, wooden, lacking in any real atmosphere or tension, pretentious too, and finally, wholly uninspired, obvious ripoff. I'm giving this one a charitable 2 out of 5. All right, I think I've suffered enough. I hope you enjoyed this review, and if you didn't, tell me what I got wrong in the comments. Other than that, please share, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the New Movie Diary. I'll catch you guys next time.